We don't quite know what to make of Trump. I mean, this is the fundamental takeaway, which is that he is unpredictable and unreliable. But what I'm really driving at is you hear him consistently speak in positive tones, even friendly tones with respect to the Prime Minister. You see their interactions at the FIFA event, bizarre, grotesque affair that it was, and he's shaking hands and smiling and seeming friendly. But then his commentary and his actions with respect to trade are barefanged hostility.
Only President Donald Trump could smile warmly at Prime Minister Mark Carney at a FIFA event and then turn around and threaten Canada with another round of tariffs. It's the classic Trump contradiction. Friendly words, hostile actions, never the same message 2 days in a row. And in Ottawa, no one is pretending to be fooled anymore. Canada has learned exactly how this performance works and, more importantly, why it never deserves to be taken at face value. The moment in question comes from Trump's highly public interaction with Carney during the FIFA gathering, where he projected an image of harmony, joked comfortably, and acted as though the Canada-US relationship was on a stable, predictable foundation. But behind the smiles, the policy reality remains unchanged. Washington continues to apply pressure on Canada across key trade sectors, from steel and aluminum to autos and softwood lumber. Trump has repeatedly argued that NAFTA never worked, has dismissed parts of CUSMA as obsolete, and has insisted that North American trade must be rebuilt around bilateral deals where the United States can dictate terms. Carney's government, meanwhile, maintains a disciplined and consistent posture. Canada keeps communication open, prepares for the mandatory 2026 USMCA review, expands its trade diversification strategy, and refuses to react emotionally to every new shift in Trump's tone. The contrast between the two approaches becomes the story itself, one leader performing, the other governing. This is not new behavior. Canada has witnessed this duality ever since Trump first entered politics. He presents himself as charming and complimentary in public, the relaxed handshake with Carney, the friendly body language, the casual remarks about shared respect, but his policies move in the opposite direction. The deeper pattern is unmistakable. Diplomatic friendliness is a stage act. The real Trump is found in the tariffs, the threats, and the political opportunism. Analysts like CTV's Scott Reed capture it well. His reaction to Trump's mixed signals was essentially a shrug. There is simply no reason to take the friendly facade seriously when the administration's actions continue to impose costs, challenge trade frameworks, and disrupt North American economic stability. If Trump has been consistent about anything, it is his dislike of multilateral trade architecture. He distrusts NAFTA, he has tried to weaken or sidestep USMCA, and he repeatedly argues that the U.S. should negotiate with neighbors individually rather than as part of a shared system. He prefers bilateral deals because they allow the United States to dominate the terms, creating a negotiation environment where smaller partners are placed under maximum pressure. Reuters reporting throughout 2025 reinforces this trend. Trump sees multilateral rules as constraints rather than protections, and he views North America not as a cooperative economic zone, but as a competitive field where leverage is the only currency that matters. What makes Trump unreliable is not only his two-faced diplomacy, but also the fact that his decisions are driven by U.S. domestic pressures. His approval rating, hovering around 36%, creates vulnerability. Inflation and rising consumer prices continue to frustrate Americans. U.S. farmers and manufacturers are uneasy about tariff costs, and Trump remains acutely sensitive to stock market swings. These pressures mean that his trade policy is reactive. When the base complains, he retreats. When he feels politically threatened, he escalates. There is no long-term strategy guiding the United States, only a series of short-term survival instincts. This volatility makes continental planning nearly impossible. For Canada, trusting Trump's assurances would be naive. That's why Ottawa increasingly treats his friendly moments as temporary, not meaningful. Carney's response to Trump's unpredictability is grounded, strategic, and remarkably steady. Canada increasingly focuses on building a broader economic architecture that does not rely exclusively on U.S. goodwill. The country is deepening relationships with South Korea, Japan, the EU, and ASEAN, and reopening channels with China when appropriate. Canadian exports beyond the U.S. have grown significantly, reinforcing the wisdom of diversification. At the same time, Canada is preparing seriously for the 2026 USMCA review, knowing that the multilateral framework will be essential in restraining Trump's instinct to drag Canada into bilateral negotiations. Ottawa understands that stability does not come from trusting Trump's words. It comes from strengthening the structures that limit Washington's unilateral power. And perhaps most importantly, Canada no longer reacts emotionally to Trump. The days of panic over every tariff threat are long gone. Carney presents a calm, disciplined counterpoint to Trump's volatility. The message is clear. Canada is not intimidated, not manipulated, and not dependent on presidential mood swings. What makes this moment especially striking is that Canada is no longer reacting to Trump as though he defines the limits of its economic destiny. Ottawa has quietly spent the past year constructing alternative pathways that reduce Washington's leverage and increase Canada's global weight. The South Korea Defense Partnership, the AI cooperation agreements with Germany and the EU, and the expansion of clean energy ties with Japan are part of a larger strategic repositioning. These are not symbolic gestures. They represent a structural decision. Canada will not allow Washington's volatility to determine its future. Even in the business world, the trend is visible. Microsoft, Hyundai, Volkswagen, and multiple EU investors have all cited U.S. instability as a factor pushing them to expand north of the border. Canada's political steadiness, especially compared to Trump's governing by impulse style, is becoming a competitive asset. Ottawa isn't just surviving Trump's chaos, it is converting that chaos into advantage. And this is where Trump's two-faced diplomacy backfires. Each time he praises Canada in public and then attacks it through policy, he reinforces exactly why companies, allies, and even U.S. commentators view Canada as the safer long-term partner. Trump is not only undermining his own credibility, he is strengthening Canada's. Trump's contradictory behavior at the FIFA event, friendly gestures followed by renewed aggression, perfectly encapsulates why Canada no longer builds policy around what he says. What matters is what he does, and what he does is destabilize North American trade, undermine multilateral structures, and pursue short-term political advantages at the expense of long-term continental cooperation. Canada sees this clearly now. Ottawa is diversifying, strengthening alliances, preparing for USMCA's next chapter, and refusing to be drawn into Trump's unpredictable orbit. The handshake may look friendly on camera, but Canada understands the difference between optics and reality. The real question going forward is this: when the 2026 USMCA review arrives, will Trump still be playing the same two-faced game, or will Canada's broader global strategy leave him with far less leverage than he expects? Either way, Canada is ready.
Tech stocks represent almost half of the value of all American stocks, and American stocks, by value, represent more than half of all stocks on the planet. Whoa! Are we putting too much money into this? Is the AI bubble about to burst?
Here's the truth no one in Washington wants to say out loud. If the US AI bubble pops, it won't just take down Silicon Valley, it could send shockwaves through the entire American economy. And at a moment when President Donald Trump is betting his second-term economic story on soaring tech valuations and AI hype, Canada is quietly building something far more durable: real power, real resources, real national sovereignty.
Stocks and AI, because And this is crazy. More than a third of stock value on America's main stock index, the S&P 500, comes from just 7 tech companies, all heavily invested in AI.
CBC's investigation recently posed a blunt, almost unsettling question. If the AI bubble pops, will the whole U.S. economy go with it? The concern isn't simply academic. Over the last 3 years, since the launch of GPT 3.50, American markets have been climbing one monumental wave. But a closer look reveals that nearly 1/3 of the entire S&P 500's value now comes from just 7 companies, almost all riding the AI surge. NVIDIA has become the face of this concentration. Its chips power roughly 90% of the world's AI systems, its valuation has skyrocketed past several $1 trillion, and its influence is so dominant that its stock performance alone can move global markets. But behind the scenes, the company has been engaging in what analysts call circular investments, pouring billions into AI firms that then use that money to turn around and buy NVIDIA's chips. Goldman Sachs now estimates that up to 15% of NVIDIA's sales next year could come from this closed financial loop. Meanwhile, American tech giants have been borrowing heavily, issuing record volumes of corporate bonds to keep up with the exorbitant costs of new data centers, facilities that, according to recent reporting, now cost more to build than all other U.S. manufacturing projects combined. These centers require staggering amounts of electricity, cooling, land, and infrastructure, yet many of the companies behind them continue to lose money at breathtaking speed. OpenAI, for example, is forecasted to lose more than $70 billion over the next 3 years, even as its valuation approaches $500 billion. All of this raises a simple, uncomfortable question. How long can the U.S. economy ride a wave built almost entirely on expectations rather than profits? President Trump routinely points to the stock market as proof of American strength. But peel back the surface, and it becomes clear that the market's resilience depends overwhelmingly on a handful of tech giants. If AI spending slows or investor optimism fades, the repercussions will be felt across the entire economy. This isn't just about a volatile sector. It's about the foundational role that tech now plays in America's financial system. As one analyst put it, tech stocks aren't just driving the market, they are the market. The AI sector also carries a paradox that traditional industries don't face. The more customers these companies gain, the more money they lose. Every query costs energy. Every model update requires thousands of new chips. Every training run demands massive capital outlays. The entire industry is built on the assumption that profitability will eventually arrive, somehow, someday, through a breakthrough in automation or artificial general intelligence. But investors are beginning to wonder how long they can subsidize the promise. This is where Canada's story becomes compelling. While the United States doubles down on AI speculation, Canada is grounding its future in assets that generate lasting value. Ottawa is expanding a clean energy grid that already sits at 85% emissions-free. Provinces are building high-voltage transmission links to move power across regions. New LNG corridors are emerging on both coasts. Critical mineral mines are being fast-tracked through the Major Projects Office, and Canada is deepening partnerships across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe to diversify trade away from an increasingly unpredictable United States. This contrast could not be sharper. The U.S. AI sector consumes electricity at a pace that utilities across multiple states now warn is unsustainable. Some regions are facing energy shortages, construction delays, and grid instability. Canada, by comparison, has decades of surplus hydroelectricity, vast potential for wind and nuclear, and the ability to export power-intensive products the world actually needs. When Prime Minister Mark Carney calls Canada an energy and resource superpower, it isn't rhetoric. It is a statement rooted in geography, engineering, and global demand. There is a geopolitical dimension here that often gets overlooked. Trump's second-term strategy, his tariffs, his pressure on allies, his America First negotiations all hinge on the U.S. economy staying strong enough to absorb the blowback. But if the AI bubble even partially deflates, that leverage collapses. A 10% correction in tech could wipe out trillions in market value. A deeper drop would push the United States toward recession. And because tech makes up nearly half the value of American equities, the shock would cascade through pensions, banks, and global markets. Trump needs the AI surge to hold. He needs the Magnificent Seven to keep climbing. He needs investors to believe the future payoff will justify today's extraordinary spending. But the fundamentals tell a different story. AI models age quickly. Chips become obsolete within a few years, and the infrastructure decays faster than any traditional industry. That is not a stable foundation. It is a pressure point waiting for a trigger. And this is where Canada's national confidence is rising. Canada's strength is rooted not in speculation, but in tangible value: vast natural gas reserves, strategic mineral deposits, immense hydro capacity, emerging Arctic trade routes, and a clean power industrial base that companies around the world want to tap into. These are assets that don't burst or deflate because they aren't tied to investor psychology. They are tied to physical demand. While Trump leans on the Magnificent Seven, Canada is building coalitions with South Korea, the UAE, Asian nations, Japan, and the European Union. The U.S. is concentrating risk. Canada is distributing opportunity. If the American AI gamble falters, Canada becomes one of the safest, most stable, most energy-rich economies in the Western world, and the global market will notice. There is an even deeper implication. If the AI bubble weakens, Trump's political model weakens with it. His tariff threats lose power. His economic narrative loses credibility. His ability to pressure allies diminishes. A market crash wouldn't just shake Wall Street, it would shake the geopolitical hierarchy of North America. The question that will define the next decade isn't whether AI will change the world. It will. The question is whether the payoff arrives before the correction. If it arrives, the United States will soar. But if the correction hits first, America will face an economic shock unlike anything since 2008. Canada isn't waiting for that answer. It is building a resilient future now, one rooted in clean power, critical minerals, diversified trade, and real assets that don't evaporate when a bubble bursts. In a world obsessed with prediction, Canada is preparing for reality, and that may be the smartest move of all.
With the salaries and the benefits, which is long overdue. So thank you for your patience on that. But then scaling up the actual material even more broadly, and it's more than $80 billion over the next 5 years. We're going to focus. This is what we can control. That's kind of the core message. Is yes, we've got to negotiate with the Americans and all that stuff.
Canada's new national budget isn't staying on paper. It's already shaping the real world. During a visit to a medical simulation center in Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney demonstrated exactly how billions in new healthcare funding are transforming frontline training. From bedside ultrasound to high-precision laparoscopic simulators, the visit provided a real-time look at how Canada's healthcare system is beginning to rebuild after years of strain. Throughout the tour, Carney engaged directly with trainees, instructors, and emergency physicians. The footage shows him asking about diagnostic tools, learning how portable ultrasound devices have become essential in emergency care, and testing a laparoscopic simulator used to practice complex procedures safely. He even participated in a blood pressure demonstration as trainees explained how modern devices streamline assessments. The interactions are informal and hands-on, revealing how rapidly medical training is evolving. Physicians describe how skills once limited to specialists are now standard for new graduates, while instructors emphasize how simulation enhances safety by allowing repeated practice. Carney's curiosity and active involvement make the visit more than ceremonial. It becomes a clear illustration of why investment in training and technology matters. The overall tone signals a shift. Canada is confronting healthcare pressure with practical upgrades, not abstract discussions. This facility tour is a deliberate choice. It highlights why the new national budget dedicates massive, sustained resources to healthcare staff, salaries, technology, and education. During conversations with staff, Carney points out that salary improvements and benefit increases were long overdue, reinforcing the message that retaining talent requires long-term financial stability. His emphasis on predictable funding aligns with the government's broader strategy, giving hospitals, training centers, and medical schools confidence to plan further ahead than one funding cycle. For years, Canada's healthcare challenges stemmed from chronic underinvestment in training capacity and outdated equipment. By highlighting frontline tools and real-world skill development, the government signals that the budget is the beginning of a systemic rebuild. Conversations throughout Carney's tour make Canada's broader strategy unmistakably clear. Every interaction points to the same conclusion. The country is modernizing its healthcare workforce by elevating both training standards and technological capability. Physicians emphasize how bedside ultrasound, once confined to specialists, has become a core skill for new emergency doctors. Instructors explain how simulation-based learning dramatically improves safety, allowing students to rehearse high-risk procedures until they reach full confidence. Carney's active participation underscores the government's message that modernizing training is central to the budget. His willingness to try simulators and ask technical questions signals that healthcare renewal cannot wait, and that technology-driven training will define the next generation of Canadian clinicians. Politically, the visit comes at a crucial moment. Canadians are frustrated with long wait times, crowded ERs, and difficulties accessing family doctors, and the government needs to show progress that people can see. By highlighting a training center already benefiting from the budget, Carney presents a narrative of action rather than promises. His direct engagement helps frame the investment as practical and immediate, not distant or theoretical. The visit also reinforces a broader argument that healthcare modernization is tied to national resilience. A capable, well-equipped workforce strengthens productivity and stabilizes essential services. By grounding this message in real-world examples rather than political language, the government positions healthcare rebuilding as a central pillar of Canada's future. What appears to be a simple tour is, in reality, a window into the philosophy behind Canada's most consequential budget in years. Carney isn't just announcing funding, he is showing how that funding transforms training, technology, and the skills pipeline that keeps the system running. Equipment is arriving, training is scaling, and investment has begun. The real test is whether Canada can expand these efforts fast enough to meet nationwide demand. The foundation is finally being rebuilt, and the next steps will determine whether Canada's healthcare system can turn a corner after years of crisis.
We can't do so without acknowledging the elephant in the room. President Trump continues to take direct aim at Canada. Well, he's going to really go after us now. I'm reading my speech. I just called him an elephant. But anyways, can't call that guy any name.
In a crowded ballroom at Toronto's Empire Club, Ontario Premier Doug Ford paused, smiled, and mentioned the elephant in the room. The audience laughed, but the message was unmistakable. For months, President Trump's latest tariff wave had unsettled both sides of the border. Duties on steel, autos, aluminum, lumber, even critical minerals. Washington called it strength. Ottawa called it provocation. Ford turned a luncheon into a defining moment. He told business leaders that Ontario would not be pushed around by U.S. policy. The mood changed instantly. What began as a light remark became a signal that Canada was ready to fight back. Trump's 2025 tariff expansion touched nearly every industry that links the two economies. Steel and aluminum face new surcharges. Auto parts, once exempt, were suddenly taxed. Furniture, copper, and heavy trucks joined the list. Even film and semiconductor manufacturing fell under Washington's widening national security umbrella. For Canada, the effect was immediate. Ontario alone exports more than $80 billion worth of manufactured goods to the United States each year. Every new duty squeezed margins and threatened factory jobs from Windsor to Hamilton. Ford's speech marked a turning point. He described these measures as attacks on a partner, not on a rival, and he acted before Ottawa could. Ontario introduced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, a signal that the province would no longer stay silent. At the same time, Queen's Park launched a $75 million Canadian campaign built around Ronald Reagan's old warning against protectionism, running in both Canadian and U.S. markets. For Ford, it was as much about livelihoods as politics. Ontario's industrial belt depends on cross-border trade. His voters see the impact of every plant closure. Taking a stand wasn't symbolism, it was survival. Trump's plan sought to pull production back to America, but by October 2025, it was producing the opposite effect. Canadian manufacturers began investing in domestic supply chains. The Ontario Chamber of Commerce reported a 12% rise in new industrial permits during the third quarter, driven by steel finishing, auto components, and clean energy materials. Export Development Canada noted that more firms were seeking insurance and credit for European clients, reducing dependence on U.S. orders. Instead of weakening Canada, the tariffs pushed it toward greater self-reliance. In his address, Ford framed Ontario as capable of becoming one of the richest and most secure regions in the world if it harnessed its own talent and resources. Behind the optimism was calculation. By taxing electricity exports and promoting Made in Ontario, Ford leveraged the sectors where his province holds real power: energy, minerals, and advanced manufacturing. Analysts estimated Ontario's grid supplied roughly 6% of New York State's demand in 2024. Even a small surcharge reminded U.S. states how deeply their economies depend on Canadian energy. Meanwhile, data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics showed a 5-month decline in manufacturing employment through September 2025, with 78,000 fewer factory jobs than a year earlier. Ontario's policy response also had a psychological effect. Business confidence surveys by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business showed a steady climb through late 2025, reversing months of uncertainty. Companies that once delayed investment decisions began accelerating production to meet new domestic contracts, especially in transportation equipment and battery materials. The Ontario government set up a new task force connecting auto suppliers with provincial mining firms to ensure stable access to nickel, lithium, and copper, key components for EV manufacturing. These moves transformed the tariff shock into a catalyst for industrial planning. The shift may be modest in numbers today, but symbolically, it marked the rebirth of economic nationalism on Canadian terms. The irony was clear. A policy meant to protect American workers was beginning to erode their industries, exactly the kind of reversal Ford had warned about. The echo echoed far beyond Toronto. In Washington, officials were surprised not by Ottawa's diplomats, but by a provincial premier speaking directly to U.S. power. Regional leaders along the border quickly noticed. Governors from manufacturing states voiced concern about higher electricity prices and supply chain delays. Industry groups in the Great Lakes region called for clarity on tariffs, saying the back-and-forth measures were disrupting deliveries of parts and materials. Trump, accustomed to controlling every headline, suddenly faced a story he didn't script: a Canadian leader challenging his policy head-on. It underscored a shift among U.S. allies who have grown weary of uncertainty. In Europe, Japan, and South Korea, governments had already signed sectoral trade frameworks, setting tariff caps at 15%. Canada, bound by geography and supply chains, had less flexibility, until Ontario forced the issue. By standing firm,
Ford reframed the conversation. Rather than pleading for relief, Canada was now seen as the steady player defending predictable rules in North American commerce.
As the applause faded in the Empire Club ballroom, one thing was clear: the tone of Canada's relationship with Washington had changed. Ford's humor, his Reagan references, and his direct language toward Trump all served a purpose: to announce that Ontario would defend its economy on its own terms. The months ahead will test whether that strategy holds. The electricity surcharge, the advertising campaign, and the surge in local investment all signal a broader shift toward economic independence inside a volatile North American market. For the United States, the lesson is the same one history keeps repeating. Tariffs can buy leverage, but they can also breed isolation. When partners start protecting themselves instead of cooperating, the costs multiply on both sides of the border. What began as a push to reindustrialize America has instead encouraged Canada to do the same, not out of rivalry, but out of necessity. Ford's speech was more than a rebuttal. It was a turning point. Trump's tariff strategy aimed to reassert dominance. Instead, it awakened a new assertiveness in Canada, one that no longer fears the elephant in the room.